I listened to a podcast this week by Kate Bowler and Anne Lamott entitled Loved and Chosen from Bowler's podcast, Everything Happens. The overall theme of this episode revolved around a world being filled with things that are out of our control, and yet being reminded in the hope that comes when we reach for the truths around us. Specifically, the truth of surrounding us with people who love and choose us for who we are in this moment. Towards the end of the episode, Lamott admits that she sometimes wonders if she's in the wrong profession as a known writer because of her people-pleasing tendencies and the desire to be liked by everyone. As someone with those two strong characteristics as well, my ears perked up even more. Lamott went on to say that people will tell her they don't like her because she's a Christian, and other people will tell her they don't like her because she's a left-wing liberal Christian. As she's grown to love and choose herself for who she is, her response to these different types of people is, well, you get to think that. And then she thinks to herself, what would Jesus do in this moment? And she thinks that in these moments, Jesus would probably say to these people, hey, can I get you a glass of water? There are many things that I love about this conversation between Bowler and Lamott. For starters, these negative internal feelings from Lamott were acknowledged, and a reminder that I'm not the only one with these type of people-pleasing tendencies. The second thing was the recognition from Lamott that people have the right to not like her, and she doesn't have to change because of that. For her, this statement of "you get to think that" was made without judgment towards those saying mean things towards her, but also towards herself. And finally, Lamott brings Jesus into the conversation in a real and attainable way. She remembers that Jesus wouldn't judge these folks for judging others. He wouldn't find an equally harming statement to say to them. But he probably would share a glass of water with them and have a conversation. And so I see in this conversation an invitation that comes to life through the story between Jesus and the unnamed woman at the well. Jesus shows us how to have a vulnerable and real conversation with people that we may not fully know or fully understand, in a way that respects one another and maybe even brings about real change. This scripture that we heard read is often used to provide a story of God's everlasting love that comes through Jesus, or how Jesus shows us an example of what an inclusive love could look like, or how we see another side of Jesus in a fully human and a fully divine state by asking for help and then offering a new kind of living water in return. But this story can also provide us with an outline for how we can have vulnerable and real conversations with people in both inside and outside of our community. So as we walk through the encounter between Jesus and this unnamed woman, we get to see these two strangers being vulnerable with the other, and each asking questions to better understand one another. Jesus begins the conversation by being the vulnerable one and asking a Samaritan woman for a drink of water in order to quench his physical thirst. And the Samaritan woman responds with the truth of who she is and the truth of the day's customs, saying, "You're not supposed to associate with me, so why are you asking this of me?" And Jesus quickly responds that he can offer this new kind of living water that will forever quench her thirst, then revealing a vulnerability of this woman. We can see here how powerful truths start to be revealed and how we could model this type of vulnerability in our own conversations by sharing the truth and asking for help. Real and authentic conversations must start with a mutual vulnerability, especially when they revolve around differing of beliefs or experiences. And the two continue this banter of stating their truths and then asking questions of one another, which is another important distinction in this conversation. Questions are vital pieces for fruitful conversations to deepen relationships and offer better understanding of one another. So the questions being asked here are for that better understanding of one another. They're asking questions and listening to one another for information. And they are not just listening in order to respond with "you're wrong" and "I'm right" response. Something that I think is often all too common in today's world. And another important thing that we can infer with these verses is the idea that this conversation probably took longer than what is shown in this story. What we can see in these verses is how the Samaritan woman is confused a few times at first, and yet she doesn't walk away from the conversation. She takes the time to listen and understand what Jesus might be saying to her. These getting to know and understand type of conversations do not happen quickly. They're usually not understood the first time around, and they can be emotionally draining in the moment. And we see and infer together that Jesus and this unnamed woman are each taking the time to be present with one another during these holy interactions of communicating together. One important thing to remember is that one of the Gospel of John's distinguishing characteristics are the "I am" sayings. In this story, Jesus reveals himself for the first time with his first "I am" saying to the woman at the well. We get to observe in this conversation the importance of being open to surprises when we have these authentic conversations with others. If we're willing to be vulnerable, open, and patient, we might be surprised what can be revealed through others in these moments. And finally, an outcome that we see in this conversation that is vulnerable, open, patient, and surprising is that maybe we could be changed too. Change can happen through learning. We grow when we know more. And the Samaritan woman came to the well, ashamed and outcasted. But she left the well, vulnerable and holy with this interaction as a believer and a disciple with a community. All because of one intentional conversation. As I ponder this scripture with this focus on intentional interactions with others, I am again struck by the invitation Anne Lamott offered in the Loved and Chosen episode with Kate Bowler. Aside from recognizing her own vulnerabilities and possible roadblockers, she wants to be open to sitting at the table with those of differing beliefs and have a conversation with them, maybe even sharing her favorite M&Ms. She recognizes how easy it is to ghost people or act like she's better than them or just move forward on her own. But she's taken the time to remember that Jesus has shown us how to be vulnerable in our storytelling and vulnerable in our listening. And that is something that has already changed the world. So I wonder what it could look like if we went back to those intentional moments of community, of communicating for community. I wonder if we did, how our world might change today. Because our world seems very divided. We are this or that, right or wrong, good or bad. And honestly, I think it's not a very interesting life when it's only this or that, because there's so many other beautiful things to consider if we're willing to be open to more than one thing. If we're willing to be vulnerable and open ourselves up to tell the truth and to listen to someone else's truth, even if we believe that they might be wrong. I might be naive. Well, I probably am naive. But I also believe that in this naiveness, there's also a lot of hope. There's hope that when we sit together with one another at the table and build community, we can grow together. We can change together, and we can flourish together. And I haven't really seen a lot of change happen when we attack one another, or only point out each other's faults, or act like we're better because we're on the right side of things. Because as humans, when this happens, we tend to get defensive or put up walls or further critique the other side of things. But I have heard stories of communities who learn to love one another in spite of their differences, because they realize in their interactions with one another that they are all actually real humans too. I'm thinking particularly of the community Neve Shalom in Israel-Palestine. In this community, Palestinians and Israeli citizens live together side by side in peace. Their community includes Christians, Jews, and Muslims who learn from one another and try to educate others to bring about peace and justice. When I visited there over 10 years ago, we walked around their shared worship space and meditation space, and were told that it was intentionally built as a circle, where no corners could be claimed by one person or one group, so that all could be shared by everyone. Peace in most of that holy land is a far-off dream for some. And yet this community continues to grow and continues to share a life of what could be. A life where we invite in those outside of our community, arriving vulnerable, listening with curiosity, taking the time that is necessary, and being open to what could be. So I invite you to think about the conversations that you want to have, the conversations that maybe you need to have, and open yourself up to walking into them, asking for a glass of water. You might be surprised at what you receive from this open and curious invitation.